Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Digital Trade Day. Great to see so many women and quite a few men to the experts. So we're very glad to host you to our offices. We're like early supporters of TradeExperettes. And I think, I look forward to the discussion today, which will be extremely interesting and very timely as well. I was talking to Hannah just before, and I was interested to say that, she just launched, the idea of the TradeExperette, on Twitter, and it just did a snowball effect. And then within like 24 hours, she had like 120 people interested. And I think that's the kind of community we want to create the debate. So, I think also, if you look at the diversity and the inclusion, it's very important. We need to have good conversations. We need a lot of people from very diverse backgrounds, and especially when we're talking about trade and digital trade. Looking at digital trade, it's basically one of the most promising area of the trade. And this is why today's discussion is very important, because for that, you do need a data flow which is seamless, which of course is going to respect, the privacy which is needed, but also going to actually allow a lot of people, but also a lot of companies to trade. If you look at, for instance, us, we do a lot of trade. A lot of our products inherently, get traded. Like if you look at our emails, you look at our videos, I think 50% of the YouTube videos actually are seen into more than one country in Europe, which is quite interesting. But we also believe it's important to actually enable. And this is why we have actually a market tool, which allows SMEs to actually get insights, from digital data about where actually their products could actually be sold. And we help them to actually come up with an online strategy and develop their capabilities. And this is what we need. We need more companies and more people to be able to actually feel the benefit of digital trade, because ultimately this is actually what helps for consumers, for instance, to have like lower prices. And I don't know if we could actually curb the upcoming inflation, but at least, it could help. So anyway, enough of that. I would like to welcome Hannah. I would like to welcome all the panelists, and I look forward to this discussion because digital trade is maybe, the most important which is happening between Europe and the US, which is like the most important trade relationship. And we think, we really need a privacy shield, number 2, which I heard is really coming up soon. And we need like really data flows which are going to make coherent in terms of legislation, and are going to make sure we increase that. Thank you very much. Hannah.
Thank you so very much for this, Karen. Actually, I think, why don't we just jump up and do the panel right away? That's all right, right, Leonard? Will we be needing this? No? All right. So you're right there, Rupert. Today I'm number 1 in terms of microphones.
She is the boss.
All right, everybody. Thank you so very much for that, Karen. Welcome, everybody, to TradeExperettes Digital Day. This is an epic day for us, TradeExperettes, and an epic day that we're working together with Google. So we're super excited to be here, and we're so grateful to Karen and to Leonard and to the entire global team, because with their help, we're pulling off a global digital day. So we're starting off here in Brussels, and we're going to do data flows here, and then at 4 p.m. our time, we're going to move over to DC and have an in-person event there. They're going to be talking about emerging technologies. And then we will be signing it off to Eunice in Singapore, who will be hosting the event, the virtual event on trade policy at these times. And this is also the start of our TradeExperettes digital year. So everything we do this year is going to be about digital trade. And this is our big kickoff. And if that wasn't enough, today is also the launch of our 10 quick wins for digital trade. So that is our flagship, sorry about that, publication. And we have pulled together 16 trade experts from all over the world. We have academics. What are you guys?
Yeah. We're academics.
Academics, policy experts, policy makers, and private sector. And we have, the aim is to gather research and expertise to really understand the underlying issues of digital trade, I think, is part of a sort of a misnomer as it has gone by. It's really, because if there's a digital trade, there has to be an analog trade, and that's sort of hard to find, I think, these days. Everything has a digital part to it. We will have a formal launch of the 10 Quick Wins next week at the public forum at the WTO. And the idea is to inspire conversations and negotiations as WTO members are looking to build on the success of the MC12 and also increase the momentum of the discussions there, but as well as within the member states and bilaterally. So in that we have 16 experts from all walks of trade and for all over the world. And this report is available at the TradeExperettes.org website, easily accessible, every chapter there. And they deal with everything from all the issues that we usually talk about when it's about trade. So it's regulation, standardization, it's financial inclusivity, it's trust, it's SMEs, developing countries, how to deal with trade facilitation, capacity building, put on a gender lens, and also how to build a conversation with a broader engagement. So without further ado, we're jumping right into our session. So very, very welcome to our session. Data flows, by the way, is chapter 4 in the 10 Quick Wins. But we are here to speak about the regulation of transatlantic data flows, challenges, and hidden protections. And this panel is not an exhibition, but it's not a monologue. It is a fruitful, a frank, and informative conversation. And the idea is to have very practical takeaways for all. And to my help here, I have Rupert and Michelle and Louisa, and as well as all of you in the audience. So in the first half, we're going to sort of lay the foundation of what's going on. In the second half of this conversation, we will be talking about solutions, and then we will also make sure that we have a time for Q&A here to be able to really make use of this in-person event. It's been so long. So Michelle and I, we are both TradeExperettes directorates, and we will sort of be sharing the moderating and the speaking so that there's more room and space for Louisa and Rupert. So I'm actually going to start with kicking it off with a little bit of history and how we got here in these transatlantic data flows, how we were set up. So yeah, as we said, there's really no thing about digital trade. It's actually about trade in the digital economy, I think is a much better phrase to use. And data flows are, of course, the crucial blood flow that underpins everything. And as in all trade, there are regulations. And regulations are a national competence. But for data flows, whenever you're regulating that, you make local or domestic decisions, and they have international or even global repercussions. And it's an area that is rapidly increasing, and I would like to give a shout out here to Simon Evenet and Johannes Fritz for their digital policy alert, which is really, really important, an important initiative here, and is mapping that out. And their latest report just shows how much increase there is in these regulations going on. And then the question also to answer here today is whether or not the EU's approach is protectionist. And remember that protectionist means that it favors domestic firms over foreign firms. And so is that the question to be used? And to me, that is a really, really important question. And that the beauty or the protection is in the eye of the beholder. So back in 2018, I had the pleasure of running a project where we tried to map out digital protectionism across the world. And I was in charge of doing that for the EU. So in the spring of 2018, as the GDPR took sort of flight, I was interviewing a large number of people within the EU, policymakers, politicians, academics, NGOs, private sector, about whether or not the GDPR was protectionist, and we were doing the same interviews all across the world. And what was really interesting then was that as GDPR was surfacing, people were very criticizing it. They were very critical of it. And what they were saying was that it was a huge power grab. There's so many things. It was, it was very difficult. It was very costly, and so on. Halfway through these interviews, the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke. And that really changed the opinion. I'd say that was 180 degrees. So, because then people started talking that it was protectionist to not have personal protection for your consumers when they got online. So that was really, really interesting. But so the context, of course, is very important, and things are happening every day. So if we move into the transatlantic data flows, it is very, very difficult to overstate the importance of those data flows for transatlantic trade, communications, but also in the world. And many of us now know, the Schrems 1 and the Schrems 2, the sequel, and what may be coming up. And I think that many of us hadn't really thought about this issue more than the last 5 or 10 years. But what's really important to understand, I think, is that this is an issue that has been going on for 25 years. And it stems from underlying regulations and views that are underpinning the US and the European society. So for the Clinton administration in the middle of the 90s, they defined data flows to be a trade issue. It was an international issue, so it should be talked about in trade negotiations. And at the same time, in the 1995, we had the directive on data protection, the first directive on that. So it's really something that is, it's hard to bridge. So I'm going to start it off with you, I think, Rupert. If you could give us sort of a lay of the land of where we are right now in terms of trade policy and how that's going on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Anna. I'm very happy to do that. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased to be here in the discussion with you and your colleagues. Maybe let me do 2 things. I'll say 1 or 2 words on the state of play on the very specific issue of data flows in the transatlantic area. But that's only a small part of the big discussion on digital trade, obviously. And on the transatlantic data flow issues, most of you know, we had 2 judgments by the European Court of Justice. We have announced a political agreement with the US that we have now found a way through the new Privacy Shield. The issues at stake are very well known. It's the safeguards against the use of personal data transferred to the US and how much there is access from the US intelligence authorities. I think that's very clear. And the other big issue is what kind of redress. We were asking for a two-tier redress system if we have the idea that something is not working the way we want it to do. Why are we insisting? Well, you know very well that in the EU, the protection of personal data is a fundamental right, so we cannot really compromise on fundamental rights. Others might see that differently, but this is obviously a constitutional issue for us. And we will have to find a way through that which balances our needs with what the needs of the US are. Then, of course, you know this will be the basis for a privacy decision. Our regulation has a privacy decision option. And then we will have to go to the data protection authorities and the council and the parliament also have scrutiny. So a little bit of complex. Lots of people will look at it and we don't want to lose a third case. So this is why it takes a moment. But now I'm leaving this aside because this is ongoing between Reinders and Raimondo. They're talking almost every day on this. It's part of a much bigger issue, the digital trade issue. And this is by far not the only game in town. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in digital trade. You mentioned, Hannah, that this is an important the oil of the 21st century, if you wish. Trade doesn't happen without digital data flows. Very simple things, but also very complex things. And there is a top-down approach of the WTO to get a hold on that. There are the e-commerce negotiations that you're fully aware of, which will have to address this issue as well. But the real political issue for the e-commerce negotiations, if there's one issue which is important apart from the data flow, data protection, is the data localizations. Because if you mentioned the word data protectionism, this is the most egregious form of protectionism if you have to have data localization. There are other things, I'm not, Then we have the e-commerce moratorium, which is also important, and I'd like to turn to the WTO because these things need a global solution because data is global. You can transfer data so easily. And the e-commerce moratorium is something which few people maybe have really realized. There is no right to transfer data. Any sovereign state can say, I don't want the data to be transferred, or I put a tax on it, like we do on goods, a tariff. And there were sounds in the last discussion at WTO. Some countries came up with this idea, that's a nice source of revenue maybe. Maybe we should start taxing this. So don't underestimate the importance of some of these very technical things for the digital world, because if that would happen, there would be a huge disruption, or at least a huge cost. And then we have, I'll be very brief because we want the discussion in another lecture, and then we have all kinds of ongoing initiatives. We have bilateral trade agreements like the US, so everybody tries to get some principles of digital trade into the binding rules. WTO I mentioned, but also in the bilateral sphere. So we are talking to Japan in the EPA. We are talking to New Zealand. We just finished that. And we talked to Chile in the ongoing negotiations. The US and others are talking to CPTPP models and in the IPAF in the US. And this is all very technical, but these are all major building blocks of what should happen to get a hold on digital trade in the global sphere. We are also having digital partnerships, and now this is also part of the EU menu. This is more about principles and binding FTA rules. So we're all trying to set also the soft law in these areas with some of the partners we have, which might not be ready, or where we have already digital chapters and agreements to build on that and to go into a lot of stuff, electronic signatures, customs issues, and so on. All of that has a digital aspect, and you want to broaden the scope. And the digital partnerships are basically based on the G7 declaration to also give it a broad multilateral appeal. All of that will be necessary to get a hold on because the alternative is disruption, less efficient markets, also a loss of our competitive advantage in the EU and the US, because I'm going back to the transatlantic relationship, because we are world leaders in these areas. Digital services, for example, obviously the US is very strong, but there is also a lot of going on in the EU, maybe not at the big kind of Google level, since we're here, but also in other more technical niches, there's a lot of stuff going on also from the EU. I'll stop here because I just want to set the scene. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rupert. I'm going to hand it over to Luisa because I'm thinking that policymakers set the rules, but they don't always have to walk the walk. So I know that the private sector has a lot of issues going on right now. Not talking sanctions or inflation, but going back to data flows, what are you hearing?
Look, I think, Anna, thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to see familiar faces in the audience as well. I think we have a lot of the challenges in this area were already highlighted by you and by Rupert. And there are challenges for policymakers, but of course there are challenges for business. Now the business and the companies tend to they go ahead. They innovate, they develop solutions, they develop business models, they take the action. And then of course regulators start looking at some of these innovations and some of these actions that companies are doing. And of course we have two major priorities in Europe right now. There are also priorities all over the world. One is the digitalization and the digital economy, and the other one is decarbonization and greening the economy. I think these two challenges are challenges both in Europe and in the US, but also in other countries. So these two challenges will mean that companies will need to invest, will need to innovate, will need to develop solutions. what the policymakers need to do, and sometimes they don't, is to try to give some time before taking decisions on regulations, because sometimes these regulations hamper the innovation. They hamper the possibility to look into solutions that have not been developed yet. So that's one of the challenges we have today. And of course, if we start seeing one of the areas that becomes to be considered a source of revenue as well, then there is a stronger, even stronger appetite to regulate. And of course, the digital world and the digital trade and data flows are considered to be potentially a source of revenue. I'm not saying by the EU, but by some developing countries. When Rupert is talking about the fact that some countries have a lot of reluctance on keeping the moratorium on electronic transmissions, duties on electronic transmissions, because of course they see this as a source of potential revenue. And why? Because today's economy lives on data. Data that, of course, much of this data is related to people, directly or indirectly. And of course, if you have big countries and big economies with a lot of people, the governments clearly see, oh, this could be a potential source of revenue. And we need to be careful how we grant access to others to this data. So this is a big challenge, is also the fact that some governments, like in the EU, we are concerned about the privacy of our citizens, but many others are also concerned by the fact that this could potentially be a source of competitiveness for their own economy and a source of revenue. So this is why we're also seeing an increase in regulation in the world, and we're also seeing more and more measures that force data localization, precisely for these regions. So the challenges are these in general. I think going back to the transatlantic agenda, we have one major challenge is to ensure that, of course, we safeguard the privacy of our citizens, and this is very important for Europe. I think it's equally important for the US. We just don't agree on the way to do it. We have different approaches on how to do it, and we need to make sure that we have some consistency and at least some recognition that the two sides are protecting the data and the privacy of the citizens. So this is why the privacy shield is so important, to make sure that we have this consistency that allows data to continue to flow, because it is the major market for many things, for trade, for investment, but also for data flows. So we definitely need to find a solution. But going forward, we need to ensure that the other regulation that goes around it on many other technologies, from AI, from cybersecurity, is not creating more barriers and is not actually leading to market fragmentation. And of course, from our perspective, it's also important that they take into account what the business is doing. I'm not saying that the governments need to follow always what the business wants, but they need to look at the solutions that are in the market and what the business can do to support also the objectives. Because in the end, I think we all have the same objectives. So that these solutions in terms of regulation do not hamper innovation. Of course, that they are supporting the transatlantic trade, because I think that's very important. And they do not discriminate against operators on both sides. I think these are some of the other issues, I would say, that are surrounding data flows as well, but they are equally important.
Very good. Yeah, so we are here in Brussels, and it's sort of a Brussels bubble, and people on this side are very knowledgeable of what's going on, but this is, of course, broadcasted, and the Trade Experts are a global community, so I'm asking people to also keep that in mind and to sort of tell the story a bit broader, and I really appreciate that you both have done that. Thank you. I'm gonna shoot it over to you, Michelle, because as we're now starting to talk about solutions or what's going on, right? We had this fascinating conversation this morning because on the surface it looks like there's stalemate. It looks like there's not much moving on each side, and there seems to be a big gap to bridge. But actually there are some things going on in the US.
That's right. Thank you. And, you know, one of the interesting things that Rupert said is the notion of data equivalence, because we're so focused sometimes on the privacy shield that we've forgotten what's happening in Japan and, you know, the older ones that we have with Israel and others, which also will be under the spectrum because of the decisions of Schrems. But I think the interesting part in terms of the United States is we often talk about the Brussels effect, but I would say we should also be talking about the California effect. And we know the assumption is we don't have federal privacy and the equivalent of GDPR for the United States, but we have 5 states now that have varying degrees of privacy laws. I'm in Virginia, it's the weakest. California is the strongest. And the U.S. Congress now will not have action before the the elections, but they've introduced a data privacy data protection act in June. It's not going to go anywhere, but once you start putting these issues on the table, you might have some pickup. And so the question that we might think of in Europe and elsewhere is if the federal government does move in the area of federal legislation, will it be as strong as California? And so we've got effectively a regulatory patchwork of privacy. It's almost like you were saying historically, we didn't just, we've been thinking about privacy for a long time, and there are privacy laws in the United States, not as effective as GDPR and very sectoral. The question is, do we want to have, as a negotiator, as an EU, do we want a noodle bowl or a spaghetti bowl of regulatory fragmentation in the United States? That's a big concern.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we have sort of ironed out where we are and how things are looking. So what I would like to do now is to turn the page and talk about where can we go from here. Where can we go from here? Where do we go from here? You know, the TTC, is that a place to go? Is the WTO a place to go? Should we be doing this bilaterally? And also, if I may be so cheeky as to ask, what exactly is your part of the bargain? What can your section do? What can you do as policymaker? What can you do as private sector? What part does academia have in this? So let's go with Louisa first.
What is the solution?
And where?
Where? Well, I think we need urgently a solution, and we mentioned this for the EU and US because, of course, it's the biggest market in terms of data flow. Because it is important to provide stability and to the companies. That's very important, but also to the citizens, of course. Ideally, a solution at the WTO. That is what we want, precisely for the reasons we've been discussing. We don't want market fragmentation. This is an area where governments are right now ramping up regulations. So for sure, this is a moment that we should try to look for multilateral or plurilateral solutions. We know that many governments and many regions are trying to develop bilateral trade agreements where we have an approach to digital trade and data flows. We have the EU with Japan. We still need to fine tune, but we also have, of course, the model, as Rupert said, of the CTPPP. We have other models that are less prescriptive, like in RCEP, another agreement. So there is already a spaghetti ball, actually, in what comes to regulation in this area. And I think the risk is that we are going to increase when we have countries that are very big markets, that are countries that are growing economies, like India or Indonesia, where you are going to have, and we had already, India was already proposing legislation that was quite disruptive in terms of data localization. So we need to convince also these countries that it is good for them in the long term, and India in particular, because they have a very important services industry as well. that it is important that they play a ball in the sense that they should be at the table discussing how to improve regulations and not just looking at domestic interests and trying to adopt domestic regulations. Do I have a solution in terms of short term? I think we need to start developing, and we are, work with many countries, maybe the ones who are a bit more developed in this area of regulation. I mean, Japan, of course, the US, even we sometimes don't see eye to eye with the US. But in any case, I think we need to start building common ground with Korea, with many of these countries, but I think the important thing is to convince major countries, also China, even if it is difficult, to sit at the table at the WTO and discuss these topics and find common solutions here.
And where do you see the business role here? What's your homework?
I think the business is facilitator in the sense that the business wants pragmatic solutions. The business is ready to develop these solutions. The business is ready as well to show that there is enough safeguards in terms of protection of privacy. I think this is the role of business. At the same time, of course, for the business side, is always important that whatever solution, we are always not preventing innovation, not preventing new technologies from being developed. But of course, we also need to take into account issues like intellectual property or issues like, for instance, the protection of business sensitive information, because of course these are critical for business. But business is ready to showcase what technology and what new solutions can bring, also in terms of giving more safeguards to citizens.
All right. Get ready with your questions. I'm just going to have them both answer here, and then it's up to you guys to move the conversation. I think I'm actually going to throw it to Michelle first, because I'm thinking, because you're in one of the groups of the TTC, right? You're in the investment group for the TTC. So is that a forum, you think, to be moving this?
I think the TTC is an excellent forum in the sense that it's not looking at traditional trade issues and it's not getting us hung up on things like agriculture and others. And I think it really is, trade and technology. The question and sort of solution that you asked for, I think we're finding that we can't silo digital, in the sense that it's hitting us with privacy, it's hitting us with human rights, it's hitting us with contestability of markets, it's hitting all of these issues. And I think from a broader perspective is we need to stop thinking a transatlantic solution. We need to talk about capacity building for third countries to adopt similar standards. The big issue and thought that I had listening here is the difference between a framework and a regulatory framework and standards, which are often set by the private sector. And I think sometimes they get conflated. Is it possible that the US and EU and others are doing a framework of principles, and then the private sector can come in and think about actual standards? And I think that's, I find that the conflation of those two, they might have two different roles to play in the sort of flexibility of the marketplace.
Excellent. Well, Rupert, it comes down to you then. So, what do you think is the EU's role here? And how are you looking at new types of trade agreements like DEPA, for example, or the new agreement that you're negotiating with Singapore? That, to me, it sort of looks like the world has moved on, and the buck has been passed, and it's countries like New Zealand and Singapore and Chile that have been picking up. So what do you think? Where do you see the solution, and where do you see that the EU can take leadership?
Thanks. Yes. Well, maybe the first thing, the first thing I need to say, I don't think we have a one-size-fits-all model for the relationships we have What we're discussing with the US might be very different from what we discuss with India and the FTA, where we try to get some basic rules agreed. So the TTC, and this is of course part of my core sort of business day to day, has exactly meant to do that. We're in a situation where the US government has clearly said, this administration, we're not going to do trade agreements, so don't even think about the digital trade agreement with us. We also have constraints. We cannot talk about these issues without having the data flow issue solved. So that's not on the cards. But that doesn't mean we cannot have a very good discussion on the issues. And if you look at the TTC role, what they talk about in the digital sphere, not siloed, but trying to make the trade aspect there alive and ask us what is really needed. We're talking about all the issues which are discussed also in these agreements. We're talking about the role of platforms. We've had good discussions on DMA, DSA, which are a lot less controversial now than they were some time ago, because everybody sees the need to do something about the competition in the marketplace, and everybody sees the need to do something about the fake content and the hate speech and so on. So there's much more convergence. I want to say that data protection was invented in the US, not in the EU. So as you have said, there's a different approach, but the basic values behind all of that we share. So we will do these very advanced discussions on how we're going to actually work together also in third countries. That goes all the way from protection of telecom networks to what kind of content do you really want to take down, how you want to do it, what are best practices here. You don't need rules for that, but you want to talk about this with a partner who has stakes in your market, and we have big stakes in the US market. And then we have very different situation in the FTA and the sphere and the digital partnership sphere, where we try to either have a rules-based discussion, trying to make sure that all these principles of basically free flow of data with the necessary carve-outs, and here this is of course the big difference. We want an unconditional carve-out. The US want a proportionality text. We try to make sure that the big markets of the future, who are not nearly as advanced in some of the regulatory discussions we have with the US, that they adhere to some of these basic rules. And this is complicated. If you think about our negotiation with Indonesia and India, I already mentioned that, they're in a completely different space than the US, let's be honest. And here we really have work to do to get the basic stuff agreed somehow, with the caveat that I mentioned, that it will not be as sophisticated. But no data localization or very limited exception, free flow of data, something like that is what we really need with these countries, and if possible, get it codified.
All right, thank you. I'm going to open the floor to questions, but I'm also going to open the panel to questions because I have been monopolizing this. I've been asking everything that I want to know, and I want to make sure that everyone walks away from here feeling that this was time well spent. So also, Luisa, Rupert, and Michelle, if there are any questions that you want to ask each other or anyone else here in the audience, you know, the floor is open. And can I just, before we start, Clara, you're saying? The microphone, yes. I think we might need a runner. But before we start, so let me again be sure that we are super efficient with time, right? So again, conversations, not exhibitions, not monologues. Ask a question quickly so that we are as efficient with time as we just can be. All right, and line up there. That's perfect. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. Pascal Carnet from the European Services Forum. We are very interested into the work of the TTC and following them closely. But we hear from our members a kind of a frustration, because it's good to know that the governments are talking about these important issues. But we're just wondering whether we will get any result out of it for the business community. And therefore, I wonder, Rupert, if you could tell us a bit more about the future deal, which has been, in principle, agreed for many months now, but we're still waiting to see concretely what is going to be the new privacy shield. Many companies are expecting, because they are in the limbo somewhere and don't know exactly what rules they have to apply, in particular the And then if you could tell us if we understand that it is not going to be binding rules, the TTC is not that purpose, but with Singapore and Japan and Korea, you have also the digital partnership agreement discussions. Will it be possible at a point in time to go to agree on binding rules? Thank you.
Pascal is smart. He threw 2 questions in there. So why don't we get a few more gathered, and then we'll group them all.
In the name of efficiency, I'm already here.
Hey, Mia.
My name is Maria Osenius. I work in the European Commission, DG NEAR now as economic advisor, including on trade issues.
Oh.
So lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I can take the opportunity to get a bit updated. I know, Rupert, you said you didn't want to lecture, but I wouldn't mind a mini lecture on New Zealand. I know it's a small country, but since it's the latest trade agreement concluded, is there any kind of state of the art here that you are proud of and that can maybe inspire other bilateral agreements? I mean, are we pushing new standards here? And then it was so interesting, Hannah, when you recalled the GDPR and the enormous criticism, and then Cambridge Analytica and how it all changed. But I still wonder from Louisa, is there still underneath all of this criticism from a business that this is cumbersome and expensive and should ideally be revised? Or have you just learned to live with this now? Is this just acquis? Or what will happen, do you think? Thank you.
All right, any more questions from the floor? Don't be shy.
I'm happy to.
There we go. Yeah, sorry, the light is really strong. Can you really
Yeah,
tell?
we can't see much.
This is Lennart Koschwitz with Google, and first of all, thanks to all the panelists for the discussion. I have an additional question on the TTC, and perhaps that's a question for Louisa, but also for Rupert. We discussed data flows, data localization, the moratorium. We also discussed privacy, obviously, and the DSA and the DMA have been mentioned. Looking forward for the TTC, I'd be curious to hear from Rupert, but also from Louisa, which would be the next topics that are already on the agenda or should be on the agenda for the TTC to be discussed.
All right, thank you. Well, I think that's enough, right, to get us started. You seem to have a lot, Rupert and Louisa. Do you guys want to lump it together? And question, does anyone here want to ask a question too?
No, I'll be happy
You're
to
good. You're good.
try to answer the question.
All right, all right.
In particular, I mean, on the TTC, first of all, I mean, the privacy, Pascal said they're all frustrated that the privacy shield hasn't been done yet. Well, really, this is a complex issue, and I can't say much more that people in DG Justice, because it's not us, are doing what they can to get this done together with the colleagues in the Department of Commerce. And there's not a lack of interaction, but these things are very complicated, in particular because there's so much scrutiny, legal scrutiny. So they have just gone public again 2 days ago saying they were very close to getting this done, so can't say much more, honestly. On the TTC itself, well, if you look at the Paris-Saclay statement, you will see that there is a lot of work going on artificial intelligence, trying to turn these principles into something tangible, which makes sense for business. But it will remain, if you wish, it will remain principles, because we're not in the business of rulemaking at this stage. I have to be very clear on this, because we don't have a political mandate to do that. But don't underestimate the value of that, as far as I'm concerned. This is the way we will build up, and coming back to your other question, the same is true for digital partnerships and the underlying rules which are in the FTAs. Sometimes we have overlap there, but it's preparing the ground for more ambitious rulemaking ultimately. The TTC will also look at a number of issues in the various working groups, 4, 5, and 6 are the ones really, to talk about what is the practical approach if you want to tackle some of these problems, in particular misinformation. There has been a lot of exchange on that. But it's very practical for companies as well, because they want to know what to do if they host certain content. So it's more of a practical exercise. We're trying to set out an ambitious agenda for the next meeting. Obviously, that's what everybody expects. First meeting was about setting out the stall. Second meeting was really defining the policy areas. Third meeting has to come with the results. And we're having a very intense dialogue. I can't say much more, because in the end, not for me to prejudge what's going to happen in December or January, what the next date of the meeting will be. But the point that stakeholders have high expectations is certainly not lost on people like me. And on the question on what is possible in New Zealand, Maria's question, thank you very much. In New Zealand, we have a quite ambitious trade chapter on digital trade, including on issues we mentioned, data localization, but also source codes, our model of privacy, e-transmissions and so on, a telecom chapter which allows the sort of neutrality of the system that we want. So it's a pretty comprehensive chapter on digital trade in there, which we're trying to now use as we go further, which we also have with Chile, to go further and also use in the negotiations where it's going to be more difficult. And I'd say that on New Zealand, it also shows that it's possible to deal with countries which also follow the CPTPP model. Yeah? That's not necessarily a conflict in the relations we have, which is actually heartening for those who think nothing can be done because of some of these fundamental issues which we still have to solve. And the partnerships, as I've said, the partnerships are trying to address a whole host of issues which might not necessarily be already ripe for rulemaking, or the partner is not there yet, or which we're preparing the ground for later amendments in some of the FTAs. I'll just give you the list of issues which are discussed. The single window for example, digital traders, the electronic transactions I mentioned, e-contracts, which is something which is in some FTAs, electronic authentication, e-invoicing, electronic transferable records, freight stuff, which we're also trying to get in the TTC, by the way, customs facilitation via digital means, open internet access, cybersecurity, source code, crypto, and so on. So they're really trying to set out the whole stall, and not everything is maybe necessarily something you can already put into an FTA with dispute settlement rules, etc., etc. Sorry, a bit long, but I had them all.
There's a lot of questions. There was a lot to go through. Thank you, Rupert. Luisa, why don't you grab it?
Yes, I mean, on the GDPR and Mia's question, yes, I think companies already integrated it, of course. I think the big challenge now is what is happening and how the model we have in the EU is interacting with other models, and this is the big question that we have at the moment, because it's not going to be easy to have data adequacy decisions with every countries. And of course, this puts additional pressure on companies to have their own safeguards to ensure there is enough protection of data. But I think the conditions and the constraints have been integrated. On the TTC, I think for sure we want results, and I think we've been on this. We've been very vocal, and we will continue to be very vocal. And our results should primarily, it's very important that we coordinate actions vis-à-vis third countries, but I insist our primary results and objectives should be improving the transatlantic trade and investment. That remains our first priority. And I want to repeat this because this should be the primary objective along all the working groups, including working groups that are dealing with areas that are interconnected as well with digital trade. I'm talking about FTI screening or dual-use items. So all these areas have an impact on technology, so they also have an impact on digital trade. And on this is important, of course, that we try to coordinate, but always thinking about multilateral solutions. I think this is very important. We should not try to create parallel systems to the ones that already exist, because this is critical that we also bring other countries along to avoid precisely market fragmentation. So I think that if we manage to reduce the costs of doing business across the Atlantic from new areas to old areas, that would be an achievement. We are not going to revive TTIP, but there was a lot of issues in the TTIP negotiations that remain critical for our companies. I mean, we still had a lot of bureaucracy because we have different regulations, because we need to do double testing. That remain critical. We should try to simplify this. So this is very basic. I'm not talking about big technology or everything, but it remains a basic issue for our company. So this agenda is still important in the TTC.
The private sector has a very restricted role in the TTC.
Yes, well, I don't want to be overcritical.
No.
We are being heard, and even yesterday we had a discussion also with the trade unions on this. I think what the main point for the private sector is to have a good interaction with the work, and I think this is not easy because, of course, there are many working groups. But we need to have a more structured dialogue, and I think we are going in that direction. That we are not only having these big events around the ministerial, but along the process that we have more structured interactions between the two sides and the business community to make sure that in the end we have solutions that work for business.
Any other pressing issues? Yes, here's a question right here in the runner.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much.
I don't think the mic is on. Is it?
I don't think so.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much for this inspiring panel. I actually have 2 questions, but before that, I just want to say I'm Sawe Muller, Policy Director at Digital Europe. The first question, I think, Rupert, you mentioned CPTPP a little bit, and Michelle, you mentioned the kind of spaghetti ball kind of thing, and Luisa, you mentioned that we don't want things in parallel, we want as much as possible harmonized. So I wanted to ask, G7 presidency next year is going to be held in Japan, and the Japanese new trade minister Nishimura, whom EVP Dombrovskis has met this year in G7, Germany has mentioned already that Japan wants to put forward the data free flow with trust, DFFT, as a central thing for G7 countries to join. So maybe a question here to all, like how do we here in Brussels, the EU, think about this concept? That's the first question. The second question is IPEF, I believe also Rupert, you briefly mentioned there. And I know, for example, next week, Monday, the Czech presidency here in Brussels, I try not to use Brussels jargon, is going to hold an Indo-Pacific Day where Digital Europe is going to moderate a panel with government representatives from Japan and Singapore, exactly on this issue. So we know that EVP Dombrovskis was in Singapore yesterday. So DPAs with EU DPAs with Singapore, with Japan, with South Korea. And there's some talk about EU-India TTC. And the Americans has IPEF in the Indo-Pacific region. I wanted to ask the second question. Do we see here more like a competition, if we may say, or joining forces? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? There is lunch, but we will get there. You can still ask a question if there's anything else pressing.
Thank you very much. I have a very specific question to Luisa, and I'm shifting a little bit from extra-EU trade into intra-EU trade. And my question is, how important are digital issues for the business community in Europe compared to other barriers, obstacles that we still have at the single market? How important really are digital issues for you? Thank you.
And she's sitting next to Digital Europe.
You should ask her over lunch. All right, it looks like the questions are slowing down. We're also running out of time. So in closing, because as we say in Sweden, wonderful is short. And so we're running out of time. Boring lasts a long time, and that's not us. So what I would like to do is to start with you, Michelle. Because what we're going to do is we're closing it and answer these last questions at the same time, right? So if there are any closing comments, anything that you like, so if someone, accidentally fell asleep during this whole session, what is it from your summary? What is the one takeaway that you would like people to know? And then, also ask a question. So we'll go backwards. Michelle, Lisa, Rupert.
All right. I think what I got out of this in terms of using digital language is we have different operating processes, but we're trying to get to the same strategic outcome. And I would say that we're we have had so much attention on GDPR and data privacy that we need to also pay attention to a lot of other issues: content moderation, digital single market, Digital Services Act, and also I'm going to be a little bit critical here that the Court of Justice didn't come up at all except for Schrems, and they're also going after and have made rulings this week on German retention law. So if we're going to talk to the United States and say, you have issues of data retention, data privacy, and concerns that we have, I think we also need to look in our own backyard a little bit and figure out what is happening in terms of court judgments to France, to Germany about data retention. This is a very difficult issue for both firms, but also for governments.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, Louisa, you're going to bring it home for yourself.
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer the questions because I think there were three questions. On the G7 Japan, of course, we as Business Europe are also part of the B7, so the business, and we will be looking at this topic. I think this is an outstanding issue and priority for Japan for many years. So I think overall people will look at this with positive eyes. Let's see in concrete terms what is this going to mean. But if the idea is to come up with a set of principles, what we consider to be trading data with trust, I think that could be helpful, also in the multilateral, plurilateral context of the WTO. So I see as a positive aspect. Then on the competition, yeah, I don't know. I think the key takeaway I take from this discussion is let's avoid market fragmentation because everyone is trying to regulate on its own. And try to do agreements with others taking its own model. So there is a real risk here of market fragmentation where we didn't have it before. And of course, in the end, this will have a negative impact on the general trade, not just the digital trade, but also on the general trade. I think this was one aspect that was not brought today. But of course, the digital economy and the digital trade are connected with the analog trade, as you mentioned in the beginning. So if we have an impact on the digital trade, in the end, this impact will also be felt on the analog trade. So we need to be careful about this. A lot of these agreements, if they are really binding and go very deep in terms also of regulations, of course, we might have a negative impact on overall trade. Final point on the single market. Yes, I think, well, there are plenty of studies that show that we still need to do a lot to eliminate barriers in the single market and that we could even create much more trade within the single market. I will bring one clear example that for us is extremely important. It's customs. I mean, a lot was mentioned here about trade facilitation and customs. We've seen what happened when we had COVID and the customs were closed. And sometimes we had a huge queue at the border with Turkey because they were not accepting the digital documents. And we were in plain COVID. So people could not sign and present the normal documents. So this is how it can be complicated. And we have a union customs code actually that also included a lot of digital solutions, and these digital solutions actually have not been implemented yet. So we have still a lot to do in this area, also in the European side, to improve also the exchange within Europe, but also with outside Europe.
All right. Rupert, you're last.
Yes, and I'll be brief. On this last point, by the way, I agree that there is a lot of work to be done, particularly in this day-to-day customs documentation, bills of lading and so on. It's one thing that we're taking up in the TTC just to do a bit of a publicity for the TTC as well. We're really trying to look at these real problems. On the question of data flows with trust, the Japanese approach, I don't really care what the label is, but I think we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about data protection, we're talking about secure means of communication. So the underlying issues are the ones that we are discussing, and I think there is a clear distinction, and this is, I think, also why the Japanese bring it up, against against, or at least to distinguish yourself from those parts of the world where you don't have that privacy protection, that trust, where the state is everywhere, basically. And I'll stop here because this is obviously part of a much bigger political debate, but that's where it comes from. But if you break it down to the stuff we discuss here, it's exactly that. So we will certainly look very closely, and I think with a positive bias to this, whether we name it like that or not. And then there is the question of this eternal question, is there competition and, or not? Look, I mean, this question should not be posed as us against the US, even though we have these differences. This question should be seen as what do we need globally and where do we have to get the US and the EU to solve the issue. This, and it will come to the fore, make no mistake, in the e-commerce negotiations, because there we have to agree with the US on something. In the meantime, we'll go happily do our FTAs. We're like New Zealand, Chile, and so on. There is no real conflict in the way that you can deal with these agreements with different levels of ambition or bigger carve-outs, if you call it like this. But if you want to have a global framework, you have to find some sort of solution how that will work. I'm confident it can be done. I also think that in reality, as we have said, what we're trying to achieve is pretty much the same. And that we have a bigger carve-out is maybe akin to a bigger carve-out that other countries sometimes want for other public policy goals or whatever. We have countries which never sign up to ILO conventions because of constitutional issues. We can still deal with them in the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter because we respect that. So in a way, we have to find a clever solution for these issues, respecting our constitutional, if I wish, constraints, but also being pragmatic with the rest of the world.
All right, then in that case, thank you so much, everyone on the panel. Thank you so much, everyone who came. Thank you to Google for hosting us. Thank you, Clara, who has done work day and night to make this happen. Thank you to our communications team who are up in the middle of the night in Mexico City. As you may or may not know, TradeExperettes are powered by volunteers, and there's absolutely no shortage of ambition and will here. So thank you for an amazing conversation here today. All the information, so for the upcoming panels today in DC and in Singapore, and as well as the 10 quick wins, and this recording is all going to be available at the TradeExperettes.org website. And I also welcome everyone to join us as members and as Google as sponsors. So thank you very much for a fantastic morning here.
I'm on the FDI screening investment.